Chapter 7 of Tractate Nazir continues going through the laws of the Nazarite vow, now on some particularities in regards to the laws of impurity. The first Mishnah says a Kohen Gadol and Nazir cannot become impure for their dead relatives, but they can become impure for an unattended corpse. Rabbi Eliezer says, between the two of them, it's better if the Kohen Gadol becomes impure. The rabbis say that a Nazir should become impure more than even a regular Kohen. The debate is that a Nazir brings offerings for his impurity, so that's seemingly stricter than a Kohen, but his prohibition towards impurity is not permanent, so that's seemingly less strict than a Kohen. The Gemara clarifies, if it's between a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir, the rabbis say that the sanctity level of a Kohen Gadol is greater, while Rabbi Eliezer says the Nazir is greater. Some further delineate a Kohen Gadol who was appointed with the anointing oil, as opposed to just through the wearing of the priestly garments, has greater sanctity as he brings a specific bull offering. A Kohen Gadol who came into office through wearing the additional priestly garments and is currently in office is greater than a Kohen Gadol who was anointed, who left office and isn't performing any services. A Kohen Gadol who is impure from an emission has a greater level of sanctity than a Kohen Gadol who developed a blemish, as the one with the emission can resume his service the following day. Between a Kohen anointed before a battle and the deputy Kohen Gadol, the battle Kohen has priority of sustenance as he's needed by the public, and the deputy Kohen Gadol has priority in regards to sanctity. Typically, if the Kohen Gadol or Nazir are on their own, they must bury an unattended corpse. The scriptural source for this is given. It also expounds on points of the Nazir becoming impure for their direct relatives if they have leprosy, impurity, or similar, and also gives the scriptural source that a Nazir can contaminate himself with an unattended corpse, which is discussed. It disputes the necessity of particular wording in these verses and which concepts on this subject they teach. This is further discussed. New Mishnah. A Nazir becomes impure and must go through the impure Nazir requirements from being contaminated from a corpse, an olive's volume piece of a corpse, an olive's volume of decomposed corpse fluid, a ladleful of corpse dust, the spine or skull, a limb of a corpse or living body, if there's enough flesh on it that it could regenerate if attached to a person. Half a kav, a measurement of bones, half a lug, a measurement of blood, and the Nazir will become impure by touching these, carrying these, or for being under the same roof as them. If it's a bone the size of a barley grain, the Nazir becomes impure for touching or carrying it. Anyways, the Nazir will need to sprinkle with ash water from the red heifer on the 3rd and 7th days, and cut his hair, and he needs to redo his whole Nazarite term once he becomes pure and has brought the offerings. The Gemara cites an incident on the discussion of these laws. It debates the necessity of mentioning a complete corpse causing impurity, if that could be obviously derived from the fact that a limb of a corpse causes impurity. So some explain it to teach that an aborted, underdeveloped fetus transmits impurity. Some say it's to teach that the greater part of the skeleton or majority of the actual number of bones in a corpse can cause impurity, even if they don't amount to a quarter kav. It defines what exactly is this decomposed corpse fluid and what this encompasses. It discusses some related points on fluid dynamics in regards to kosher, for instance, whether a melted or poured fluid in a stream, as whether this constitutes a connection between the pouring object into a lower container, as there are thicker substances which spring back when poured. It debates this from a few sources. It also questions whether a ladleful constitutes a palmful or a handful. It also clarifies what exactly constitutes corpse dust. Some define it only as if it comes from the flesh, sinew, and bones, although this is debated. Some rule if two corpses are buried together, they become a mixture of a sort, and their dust does not contaminate with impurity. If the corpses were buried separately, decomposed, and then the dust was mixed together, that would generate impurity. Some even rule that if you cut the hair off a corpse and bury it with the corpse, their decomposed dust is a mixture and does not contaminate. It also debates the validity of impurity from corpse dust of hair, teeth, nails, and similar. It also questions if a buried pregnant woman is impure as to whether her fetus is considered a separate mixed entity or not. It cites some further related discussion on these laws as to how this applies to decayed limbs and similar. There are further points, and it also debates from a number of separate discussions as to whether the impurity is caused by a spine and a skull, or a spine or a skull. This is debated from several other sources based on the implication of particular wording on these discussions. There are additional points, and it clarifies that a bone the size of a barley grain contaminates only through touching or carrying, not through being under the same roof, and not even if they are under the same overhanging stone. The barley-sized bone would still contaminate even if it's a powder. It also debates whether a Nazir becomes impure from touching a limb without remaining flesh sufficient to regrow on it if it's still attached to the body, which is discussed further. There are also sources which seem to imply that a person becomes impure for stepping over a grave, and it's agreed that the limb in question would cause impurity if there's a bone inside, at least the size of a barley grain, although it debates if it applies without it. It also says in regards to counting days until the Nazir is repurified, based on the wording, this implies like the opinion that he restarts his now pure Nazarite term on the 8th day of purification. New Mishnah. Impurity transmitted by branchy canopies or stony protrusions, or from a grave in a plowed over field, or from countries outside of Israel, or from the coffin cover or walls, or from a quarter lug of blood, or from being under the same roof as a quarter calf of bones, or from utensils that touch the corpse, or during the days of counting, or during the confirmed days of Sarah's leprosy. For all of these, a Nazir does not become impure so that he needs to cut his hair and restart, but he does still need to sprinkle with ash water on the 3rd and 7th day. He does not need to redo any of his term, and he resumes it right when he's purified, and he doesn't even need to bring any offerings. They even said the days of impurity from a Zav or Zava emissions, or the days counted before confirming somebody with Sarah's leprosy, they count as a part of his Nazarite term. The Gemara defines branchy canopies as an overhanging tree, and protrusions are things that stick out of a wall. It asks, in regards to the impurity of the countries outside of Israel, it asks if this applies to its soil or airspace, based on the wording of our Mishnah. It says it's on the airspace, and it's debated if somebody can enter other countries without becoming impure while inside a carriage, trunk, or closet, as to whether that'll still cause ritual impurity or if it's just too uncommon to be a concern. In regards to counting the days of a Nazarite term, even during the days of counting throughout leprosy, some say this applies only during a lengthy Nazarite period. Others debate this point. It's questioned by the application by short Nazarite terms in regard to the necessity of him having his hair be at least 30 days of growth long and similar. There's additional discussion on these points. New Mishnah. Some say any impurity of a corpse which causes a Nazir to need to cut his hair, that level of impurity causes you to be liable for entering the temple with it, and not less. Others say this level of corpse impurity should not be more lenient than impurity from a sheretz creature. The Gemara discusses particular instances of these concepts. New Mishnah. Some reasons, if a barley grain-sized bone does not contaminate through a roof connection, and the Nazir still cuts its hair for touching and carrying it, then logically a quarter lug of blood, which does contaminate through roof connection, should also contaminate for touching or carrying. It was answered that although this is logical, it's not a viable comparison, as these laws are a tradition from Mount Sinai. The Gemara clarifies, the oral law is the stringency of a barley grain-sized piece of bone that it creates impurity contamination, as described. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Nazir continues going through the laws of the Nazarite vow, more in regards to the laws of contamination through impurity. The first Mishnah says, if there are two Nazirim and somebody says that he saw one of them become impure from a corpse, but he's not sure which, they both need to cut their hair at the end of the term, and together they bring an offering for both purity and impurity. And they should say, if I'm impure, the impure offering should be for me. If I'm pure, the impure offering should be for you. They also count 30 more days, and then jointly bring an offering for purity, and say that whichever of the two of them was impure before, the second offering should be for them. The Gemara asks why this should be the case, as unlike the law this is learned from, which applies in a private domain, this case is taking place with 3 people, 2 Nazirim, and a witness. So the area they're in is a public domain, so how are the cases comparable? Some simply answer that the witness wasn't in the area directly there with him and saw from a distance. Some would say the shaving of the head of a Nazir includes an allowance of the typical prohibition against rounding the corners of the head, so therefore, as in this case of 2 Nazirim of questionable impurity, one of them is cutting his hair impermissibly, so the case must be referring to either a woman or minor who are allowed to cut their hair. Some say minors actually can't round the corners of their head. The sources are brought and discussed. That's for the discussion on these laws. It generally goes through the remaining points on the prohibition for a man to round the corners of his head, which is basically a prohibition against shaving a beard. Broadly, it is permissible to shave your body, albeit for a man due to the prohibition of a man may not wear a woman's garments. It's a violation to shave his underarm or pubic region, although it can be cut. There's further discussion on this. It's held a Nazir can't remove his body hair, and it mentions some incidents where these laws were ruled on and some additional qualifications. New Mishnah. In the above case of 2 Nazirs where one of them is said to have become impure, if one of the 2 of them dies, the remaining Nazir should find someone else to take a Nazarite vow, and then they redo the whole above listed sequence. Others disagree, although it'll be difficult for him to find someone to take a Nazarite vow along with him, so he should instead bring an offering for purity and for impurity, and say whether he was pure or impure. It should go according to the offering he brought, and the other should either be voluntary or out of doubt. Then he counts 30 days and brings the offering for purity, and says if he was impure, now he's bringing this offering. If he was pure, this one's voluntary, and the remainder of the earlier one. So he's technically now bringing the offerings in separate parts, but this was still agreed with. The Gemara says the first opinion only said his opinion to test his students to see if they'd come up with the latter opinion, and there's issues with the first opinion, namely that if there's 2 people bringing offerings, there will be delay and it'll spoil. New Mishnah. A Nazir who wasn't sure if he was impure from the dead and also wasn't sure if he was confirmed to have Sarah's leprosy, he waits 60 days to be able to eat sacred foods, which was prohibited from the leprosy, and his Nazarite period ends after 120 20 days, as haircutting for Tzaras overrides haircutting for a Nazir when it's certain, but not when it's doubtful. The Gemara goes through all of the haircuttings and all of the different offerings required to be brought by such an individual and additional points. These are further discussed along with instances of particular cases. It also asks, of the 4 haircuttings required, are they done as part of the haircutting ceremony or because the actual hair must be removed as it's impure? This is practically relevant as to if you can remove the hair with a depilatory. It's explained to be as a part of the actual haircutting ceremony requirement. And that's the end of chapter 8.